So today we're going to take a look at what's going to happen if NATO and CSTO go to war in 2024. Now this event is very unlikely to happen, but just for the sake of this video. If you do enjoy watching mapping videos, then a sub to the channel would be great. But now let's get right into the video. Now just to give the CSTO members an advantage, we can see that they were the attackers. Reason is still unknown, but now let's get to the war stuff. At first we can see that the troops in Kaliningrad now push in and get to Belarus, and now they are connected to mainland Russia, looking pretty good for the red team. And down in the south we can see that the Armenians are now pushing into Turkey, but 80% of the military over here is Russian, so yeah, you should keep that in mind. Eventually they are stalemated, but still NATO has not organized all of its military, so yeah, that is why the Russians are doing so well. Up in the north we can see that the Russians are now pushing into Finland, and now they are following the coastline. Eventually we can see that the Russians have besieged the city of Helsinki, which is now disconnected from the other parts of Finland. We can see that the Russian troops enter from multiple fronts. They make a spearhead here, the northern part surrender, and after a very long siege, we can see that the city of Helsinki also surrenders, which leads Finland out of this war. The troops in Finland arrive in the Baltics, on the front lines, and we can see that the Russians were able to take Tallinn, which was the capital city of Estonia, which leads Estonia out of this war. And we can see that the troops in Kaliningrad are now pushing into Lithuania. The troops in Belarus also push in, capturing the capital city of Lithuania, which leads them out of this war. And now Latvia is getting devastated on all fronts. The Russians push in from all sides, and eventually the capital city was also taken, which leads Latvia out of this war. The invasion of the Baltic states was a huge success for the Russians, or maybe the CSTO members. Most of the military comes from Russia, so I just want to call it the Russian military instead of the CSTO military. Down in the south we can see that this stalemate is now broken, and we can see that more and more Russian troops now push into Turkey, eventually securing all of these lands. We can see that the Russian Navy also comes into action, and after a decisive military campaign we can see that Istanbul was taken. Now Istanbul is not the capital city of Turkey, but it is the economic backbone of Turkey. So yeah, Turkey not looking good. And the worst part for Turkey is that now they are about to get disconnected from all NATO countries. We can see that the Russians push around, they take the Gallipoli Peninsula, and now Turkey is on its own, except for some naval supplies. But yeah, we can see that the Russians are now pushing around in Turkey, taking all of the coastline parts. We can see that after a push, Edirne was taken, which is a Turkic city, and the Thracian parts just go ahead and surrender. I don't know if it's Edirne or Edirne, but yeah, we can see that the Russians make one more landing, and they push around and take all of the northern parts of Turkey. But at the same time, we can see that they are pushing from the main front. But once again, they are stalemated because Turkey is also not a weak country. Up in the north, we can see that the Russians finally start their invasion of Poland, which is going pretty well at first. They do manage to take most of the coastline, but now we have the Germans militarizing their country, which is not a good sign though. But now Germany is also sending their troops to Poland, and because of this we can see that the Russians do get pushed back, but they are still not pushed back all the way to their borders. And yeah, in the north we can see that the Russians are now pushing into Sweden, and they are following the coastline. We can see that they also make a naval landing, and these troops meet up. And now the primary goal of Russia is to get to Stockholm, which is located somewhere around here. So yeah, the Russians do push in, eventually besieging the city of Stockholm. And yeah, things are not looking good for Sweden. We can see that more and more Russian military arrives on the front lines. They push around and take most of the major cities of Sweden, and they also disconnect both Norway and Sweden from mainland NATO countries or mainland Europe. Eventually we can see that after a very long siege, Stockholm was taken. This island is also taken out, and with all of their major cities gone, we can see that the remaining parts of Sweden just go ahead and surrender, which is another decisive victory for Russia. We can now see that more and more Russian troops arrive on the Polish front line, and these troops are now pushing in hopes of getting to Warsaw. And after a decisive military campaign, we can see that Warsaw was taken, but the Polish still do not surrender. They do lose control of their coastline and some of their northern parts, but the remaining parts of Poland do manage to survive because they're getting constantly reinforced by the NATO countries. Now on the Turkish front line, we can see that the Russian troops now push in, and the Battle of Ankara ends in a decisive Russian victory. And unfortunately for Turkey, they won't get any support because they lose their coastline. And another bad thing for Turkey is that they don't have a good leader like this guy, whose name is Mustafa. So yeah, the remaining parts of Turkey finally go ahead and surrender, and this was a huge blow to NATO countries as they lost a very powerful country. Turkey is the 8th strongest country in the world, so yeah, huge blow to the NATO countries. And do you know what else it leads to? It leads to the Russians now pushing into Bulgaria as well as Romania. Both of these countries lose their coastline because the Russian Navy is pretty good in the Black Sea. We can see that after a push, Bucharest was taken, and because of of this, the Romanians are now losing their morale, but they still do not surrender. And we can see that the Russian troops are now pushing into Greece, and they take Thessaloniki. These islands are also now taken. And yeah, this happened very quickly, because Russia knows that once NATO has organized its military, they won't stand a chance. So yeah, they're racing for land right now, except they're the only ones getting land. On the Polish front line, we can see that more and more German troops arrive on the front line, but not all the way to their borders. But up in the north, we can see that the Norwegian troops are unable to push back the Russians, who now push in, following the coastline. The capital city of Oslo was also taken, and after losing pretty much everything that they have, we can see that Norway also goes ahead and surrenders. But now Germany is pretty stressed out about all of the situation, so they're gonna be doing what they did back in World War II, and they're gonna be putting literally everything into their military, all the money, literally everything. So yeah, you're not ready to what you're about to see, because Germany is gonna do some pretty bad stuff in Europe. We can see that the Germans storm into Poland, thus retaking all of Poland. They take Kaliningrad, and they even push into Belarus. Now, as I said, everything into their military. We can see that Minsk was taken, which leads Belarus out of this war, and we can see that the Germans are now pushing towards St. Petersburg. They were unable to take the city, but they were able to take all of the Baltic states. We can see that the Germans are now pushing into Russia, which is mainland Russia, and now they're trying to get to Moscow. Eventually, we can see that St. Petersburg was taken, and all of these troops are now at the gates of Moscow. But Germany did not learn from their mistakes back in World War II, and that mistake was they did not have to use everything. One more thing is that invading Russia is not a good thing. So yeah, they're getting pushed back, not in a good manner. We can see that all of these areas were retaken. We can see that Warsaw was also retaken, and now all of Poland is under the Russian control. We can see that Berlin was taken without any fight, because all resources were used, and we can see that Germany is left without any troops. Quite unfortunate for the Germans. We can see that Bavaria was also taken, and the remaining parts of Germany just go ahead and surrender. Yeah, that totally happened. But as of now, we can finally see that NATO has organized all of its troops, but the US is thinking about this war, and they know that they won't be able to take on Russia on mainland Europe. So yeah, what do you think are they gonna be doing now? When is the Pacific Fleet gonna be of any use? So now we can see that the US is using its Pacific Fleet, and eventually all of the US forces have arrived over here, and they make multiple landings, taking out all of these islands. They make a landing in Sakhalin, thus taking out the regional capital, which now leads to Sakhalin's surrender. And now we can see that the US has made a successful naval landing over here in the eastern parts of Russia, who, if you don't know, was putting all of their military assets in Europe, and they had nothing over here. So yeah, we can see that the US and the Canadian forces are now pushing into Russia without facing much resistance. We can see that they also make a naval landing over here in this part of Russia, and more troops arrive on the front lines. Eventually, we can see that all of the coastline parts of Russia over here were taken, and now Russia is panicking, because now they are fighting a two-front war. We can now see that the Russians are taking out their troops from Europe and sending them to eastern Russia, but as of now, these troops have not arrived, which leads to the US taking all of these eastern parts of Russia. Now, I know it's very cold over here, but it's the United States of America. Nothing is hard for them. But because the Russians took out most of their military from Europe, we can see that Germany was retaken, and the NATO forces also push into Poland. We can see that the Russians get pushed back from Greece, and Russia took literally everything out of Romania, leading to this. And now we can see that NATO forces are pushing into Turkey in hopes of re-liberating the country. Russia right now is in full defensive mode, and that is why they're getting pushed back on all of these fronts. In Scandinavia, we can see that the NATO forces make one successful naval landing, thus re-liberating the important parts of Norway. They also push in, and they get to Stockholm, and due to the fall of Stockholm, we can see that the remaining parts of Norway and Sweden go ahead and surrender, who were occupied by the Russians, but the Russians still managed to hold on to Finland. We can see that more and more troops from the UK and France enter Poland, thus retaking the country. The NATO forces also take out this island, but now in the east we can see that the Russian forces have arrived, who push back the US forces. They take out all of Sakhalin, and they were able to take most of these parts, but the US military is still getting reinforcements, and they're not completely wiped out. Over here in the west, we can see that Ankara was taken, with all of the Turkic coastline, which leads to the Russian soldiers' surrender. Armenia is pretty easily taken out, and now we can see that the NATO forces are pushing into the Baltic states, and this was a decisive victory for NATO, as they were able to re-liberate all of the Baltic countries. Over here in the east, we can see that more and more US troops arrive on the front lines. They retake Sakhalin, and these troops reconnect. And in the east, we can see that the NATO forces are now pushing into mainland Russia. They were able to take St. Petersburg, and now their goal is to get to Moscow. The NATO forces also make a landing down in the south, and Russia Russia has now lost all of their coastline down here, which is quite unfortunate. We can see that the NATO forces push in, which leads Belarus out of this war. And now we can see that all of these Central Asian countries get themselves out of this war, because even if Russia won this war, these guys could not gain anything. So yeah, smart move. Over here on the Russian front line, we can see that more and more NATO troops arrive on the front lines, and they eventually were able to get to the gates of Moscow. Oh, that was hard to say. And after several millions of casualties, we can see that Moscow was finally taken. But it is now that we can see a peace negotiation being made between Russia and the NATO countries. Okay, now let's take a look at this peace negotiation. And I've colored in only the countries which gained land. First off, we can see that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania gained land from both Belarus and Russia. Following that, we can see that Poland also got themselves some parts of Belarus. We have Turkey taking all of the southern parts of Russia. I mean, they got slapped around in this war, so they deserve it. They also got themselves Armenia. And this brown color represents the US. They took St. Petersburg. Oh, but this is not everything that they took. Yup, they took all of the eastern parts of Russia. But because the NATO forces could not get into Finland, we can see that the Russians still have Finland. But both in Belarus and Russia, there are new governments installed who are pro-Western. But yeah, this is gonna be it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what you guys want to see in the future. And thank you for watching.